Water is crucial to sustain life, food, ecosystems, human health and well-being. Still, millions of poor and marginalised women and men around the world face challenges in accessing water due to a range of ecological, socio-political, institutional and economic reasons. The focus of this month's episode of Between the Lines is a new book called Water for Food Security, Nutrition and Social Justice. IDS researcher Lidia Cabral interviews two of its authors, Lyla Mehta and Claudia Ringler, who is Deputy Director of Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. They argue for the need to improve policy coherence across water, land and food, and make the case for strengthening the relationship between the human rights to water and food, especially for marginalised women and men.
Good afternoon. My name is Lidia Cabral. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, where I currently co-convene a new master's degree in food and development. And it's really exciting to see a new book that connects to issues within the food domain from a water perspective and bringing in new aspects about water and the need to consider water in food that we haven't so far paid enough attention to. And it's very good to be in the company of my colleague Lyla Mehta from IDS and Claudia Ringler from IFPRI, both authors of this new book. So I wanted to hear from you why this book now? What's the rationale behind producing this book at this point in time?
So there's a lot of talk about the water crisis, the food crisis. And rarely do we bring water and food together. I think a key issue that we want to highlight in this book is that water is life, water is critical for life, but without water there can be no food. And these linkages are not really made very often at high-level policy dialogues. The legal systems, the policies, they're all very, very separated out. And what we've tried to do, I would like to believe that this is like the first comprehensive effort to bring together water, food security and nutrition together in a comprehensive way, beyond just the focus on agriculture and irrigation. So we're looking at questions of nutrition, health, we're making micro-macro linkages, and also we're going from local to global. And there's a lot of talk about, problems around accessing water, around food crisis, especially given the context of uncertainties due to climate change. And we focus on a lot of these challenges in terms of accessing water for food. So climate change, drivers of change, privatization, land and water grabs, etc. And so these are things that we problematize.
Yeah. And maybe to add, you might see that social justice is in the title of the book. And the reason is that we have seen that while there are now a lot of legal documents, there are the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are a lot of efforts at the global level to improve on water security and food security. But the way these global systems operate, they don't have a pro-poor focus. So if a country says, yes, I'm trying to improve on my sustainable development goals, so they might try to improve water access in urban areas because it can be done at a lower cost. There's no one out there that will say, you should first try to improve water and food security for those who are most marginalized, for the poorest, who might live in remote areas, might be underrepresented ethnic groups, etc. So there's a real problem there if we just go down in a business as usual fashion, particularly, as Lyla said, with climate change, droughts, floods. Those affect the marginalized the most. And if we don't have to actually target them for improvements in these areas, the situation will worsen a lot more going forward.
So you've both talked about climate change and the extent of a water crisis. At this moment in time, can you tell us, is there enough water for us to ensure a food secure and nutritious, secure population around the globe?
That's an interesting question. And, there are a lot of discourses around it. And it really depends on how you, from what angle you take this question. In general, globally, we do have enough water and enough food on average to to make sure that every person can lead a healthy and productive life. So those are the basic numbers. But we have huge inequities. And with climate change, those inequities are increasing. So there are floods in the UK, for example, but who in the UK will take 5 years to recover from these floods? But if we now go to a low-income developing country, somewhere in Eastern Africa, where they also have had floods recently, and before they had a very severe drought, a lot of the people there will take at least 5 years to recover in terms of income and food security levels to the level they had before the crisis. So while everyone in the globe experiences growing impacts from climate change, adverse impacts, the actual experience at the personal level, at the income level, food security level, and also long-term, livelihood and earning capacity level are so much stronger in those low-income contexts. And that's where we are just not yet focusing enough on. And that's where we have to do much more about.
I've been working on the politics of water scarcity for a very long time. And I think a big part of what I've been doing is to challenge this idea that, we are running out of water. So while there is a water crisis all the time, people are excluded from water, it's very important to ask questions about, who has access to water, why not, who is being excluded. And it's true that at the global level, you can get very lost in the statistics and the figures, but often the focus is on the physical and the volumetric aspects of water and not really looking at the distribution, the variation. And of course, climate change is causing a lot of uncertainty. It's very difficult. It's going to affect water availability. There's going to be increase of temperature. There's going to be extreme rainfall. There's more extreme events. But who is affected by that and why? And we've got to really look at the local level impacts is really, really important. So I guess in this book, what we're trying to do is we're trying to also challenge this productionist narrative that we're running out of water and food. We believe that there's enough water and food to go around, but of course, questions of distribution, questions of access, questions of mismanagement, of policy coherence is really important. We're questioning some of these conventional framings of the crisis. We want to look at some of the metrics, some of the statistics that are, and as Claudia said, often the poorest, the marginalized, their perspectives are missed out. There's plenty of statistics that tell us about the range of the crisis. Now with the SDGs and the new measurements around water, we're talking about over 4 billion people that lack access to safe sanitation and 2.1 billion that lack access to safe water. For me, that in the 21st century is a huge crime, that you're talking about millions and billions that lack access to water, and this affects their ability to lead healthy and productive lives. This affects their ability to have access to food, to deal with undernourishment. We're talking about 822 million that are undernourished, and people that are, don't have nutrients. We're talking about obesity and starvation at the same time in different parts of the globe. And all that is because of a mismanagement of water and food.
I was really surprised to hear how long it took for the United Nations to recognize water as a right, as a human right. Why do you think, especially if you compare it to food that has been recognized as a human right for much longer, why do you think it has taken so long for this recognition to actually happen?
Well, water is a very contested resource. So water is obviously culturally, spiritually, it means a lot. Since 1992, it's been declared as an economic good. And there's been a lot of resistance to that because a lot of people believe it should be a fundamental human right. It took a long time for water to be recognized as a fundamental human right. And that has surprised a lot of people because it's so obvious. You need water to live. You need water for food. You need water for a healthy life. Maybe they didn't realize this and they just took it for granted in 1948, but still it was a long battle. At the turn of the century, there were lots of raging debates about privatization. A lot of powerful actors resisted this idea of water as a human right because it was implied that then it would have to be provided for free. In reality, no human right is actually provided for free, water and food, that's not the case. Firstly, they're progressively realized, but obviously there are certain principles, equity, non-discrimination, empowerment, addressing exclusion. So these are things that states have to do. They have to respect, they have to protect, they have to try and fulfill and progressively realize these rights. Another reason why there's been a lot of resistance is probably the transboundary element, that states can claim rights on other states. It's very telling that initially, when the General Comment 2002 came out and when finally water was recognized as a human right in 2010, several powerful nations in the global north did not recognize the right. The UK didn't. Now it does. But Canada and the United States still do not recognize the human right to water.
So what does it mean in practice? What does the right to water mean?
Yeah, so as Lyla just said, another factor that makes it difficult or has made it difficult for some governments to accept the human right to water is that once they sign up to a human right to water, you can go to court and you can at least try to claim that governments have to fulfill that right. And what that could mean is that, if you have a river flowing, for example, from a water-rich country to a water-scarce or water-poorer country, that the water-poor country could then make a claim to the richer country and just say, you can very easily fulfill the human right to water for your citizens. As you can see, I can't. And as you have signed up to the human right and I have signed up, you will have to release more water to the citizens of my country. So there's definitely potential international implications to the human right to water. And given that situation, there has been a lot of reluctance for some governments to sign up.
Can you now expand a little bit on the notion of right to water and what it means in practice?
So in 2010, access to clean water and sanitation were recognized by the General Assembly as a human right. And it was affirmed that the right to water and sanitation were derived from a right to an adequate standard of living contained in several international human rights and treaties and justiciable. As I said, it's been very controversial because what does this mean in practice? The human right to water is largely focused on domestic realms. So it's been about... So some countries have had provisions on recognizing it. South Africa was one of the first countries. It went against the grain. And it had a free basic water policy, and it provided, in those days, everybody 25 liters for free. But what often happened in practice was that these 25 liters were not really enough, and especially single-headed households. And several households found it wasn't enough to meet their productive needs. And that's why the right to water has been criticized, because it's very focused very much on the domestic. It can't be used to countervail processes of, let's say, water grabbing, land grabbing. It doesn't look at the productive elements. But for people who are actually leading lives in rural areas, they don't separate out the domestic and productive elements of water. They don't separate out what they need for food from what they need for drinking. So in that sense, it's really important to bring these elements together. And in the book, we've made a case for really seriously bringing together the right to water and the right to food together, exploring them, creating more synergies, and even advocating maybe a right to water for livelihood purposes or for food security and nutrition. Some countries have got a more expansive view of the right to water. They look at the right to water in terms of livelihoods, in terms of subsistence, in terms of productive uses. And it would be great if, that could be pushed further.
You make quite a strong point in the book about exploring the synergies then between the right to food and the right to water, but you also recognize the difficulties in terms of governance, in terms of the politics of food and the politics of water, bringing those together. So where do you think we stand at the moment in terms of advancing in exploring these synergies?
I think as climate change proceeds, as we see more regional and local water shortages as a result of climate change affecting conflict affecting deprivation, more food security challenges, I think we'll see a growing realization that for securing livelihoods at risk from both water and food shortages, and looking at what those livelihoods are about, and a lot of them are small farmers, who might farm half a hectare or often much less, and they farm that to send their children to school, to sell maybe some of the crops, to really buy some basic health services, basic medicine, or to pay the school fees, and obviously for subsistence as well. So I think there will be an increasing realization over time, that these communities are increasingly hit by shocks, climate shocks, but also obviously other food price shocks that are linked to the climate shocks. And so that maybe there will be eventually a realization that a stronger linkage between the existing right to food of these communities, and in some countries the existing right to water of these communities, that it has to go further beyond their claim to having access to water just for drinking, because they can't survive on that. They can't build a livelihood just based on being able to drink water. If we don't do this, and if we are not moving in this direction, we will see a lot more out-migration. If a livelihood cannot be built, if children cannot be sent to school, if health bills cannot be paid, people will migrate out of these areas, and they will move into cities where they will have a much stronger voice that they generally don't have in rural areas. And I think once we see more of these movements, hopefully governments and other institutions will come to the realization that they have to do more to protect these existing rural livelihoods. I think it will, I'm sure these movements will happen. Of course, there could be yet other events, that will be considered yet more important than these movements and these deprivations. But certainly they will increase.
I think, as you say, we focus quite a lot on governance issues in the book, and the contestations around water and food across. And a lot of these governance mechanisms are very political, are very contested, and they have actually led to quite a lot of exclusions of very poor and marginalized people. So while you try to formalize land and water rights, you could often ignore invisible producers of water and food, invisible users. And, you look at this land and you think, oh, it's unproductive. But actually there are pastoralists there. There are women farmers there. And if you ignore their needs, you're going to really there's going to be more and more injustices taking place and more deprivation. And we've often found, and we've really found it quite problematic, that there are so many silos around land, food and water governance, and they don't really come together. So we've really made a case for bringing policies and programs together. There's been quite a lot of talk of this nexus. I mean, it exists on the ground, but in practice, it's very, very difficult to implement. And I think for me, the nexus should be around human rights, around bringing the rights to water, food together. Some could say we're being a bit utopian here, but sometimes, ideas are put forward and they're dismissed as utopian. But a decade or two later, they're quite normal. So I think we really have to think bold and big, and make a case for having, a more expansive understanding of the human right to water for food and livelihoods, because that's the only way we can, secure healthy and productive lives for all, especially given the challenges that we have today.
So you've talked about the invisibility of some of these actors, some of these claimers of rights. You also note in the book that water debates have been less political than food debates, and you talk about food sovereignty and how important that has been to push for some rights in the food domain to be claimed. So why do you think water has been less political, given all that you've said and how clearly political the issue is? Why has it taken so long for these claims to be put forward? Is it connected to the invisibility of some of the actors in relation to water?
I think, there are many aspects and many reasons. I mean, one certainly is, that water exists in many different forms. So you have, for example, a lot of the water is underground. Nowadays, from a food production perspective, 40% of the food that is irrigated, and again, irrigation alone accounts for 40% of the food that we consume, is actually underground. So you don't really see it. So you have to actually drill a well, right? And you might be out there using water, and actually no one knows how much is underground. So it's very complex. So we are using groundwater, we use surface water, we use rainwater. So it's a very complex intermix, and the hydrology is generally not well understood by policymakers and governments. The hydrology is only well understood when we have a big river that flows across the border. And everyone understands that there are issues, and then there is a lot of interest in controlling that water. And often the interest is to keep as much water inside a national boundary, which obviously makes no sense from a hydrological point of view. So the fact, that it's not just one single source, and also it's not just one single user. So the water governance system is extremely fragmented. So, for example, if I'm a city and I want to treat, all the sewage that's coming out from whatever the 20 million households in my city, I usually talk to the Ministry of Construction. I don't go and talk to the Ministry of Water. I don't talk to the Ministry of Agriculture. Then you have wetlands that are getting drained, maybe to build more houses for people migrating to cities. So you have to deal with the Ministry of Environment, if at all. And it's yet another, it's another actor in this whole fragmented space. And then if you talk about irrigation, which uses most of the water that's withdrawn for human purposes, you often have to talk to the Ministry of Agriculture. And on it goes. Fisheries is often a separate ministry. Livestock is yet another ministry. Forestry is another ministry. So they actually don't necessarily talk to each other. So the situation is so fragmented that no one has the overview of what's going on. And that just, the complexity contributes to the situation, that it's more difficult to make it political. And as Lyla said, it's fluid. It comes and goes. There's a water cycle. So irrigation, evapotranspires the water, but it goes up and it rains down. And sometimes in a different continent, sometimes in a different country. So, there's recent evidence that the Brazilian rainforest, for example, which is obviously one of the most important biodiversity, obviously, areas in the world, but also water generation areas. So the water goes up, it's a river in the sky, and it rains down, among others, in southern Brazil. So they start to experience some droughts there, but the policymakers, even inside Brazil, might not necessarily agree that this is happening and that they might now have a drought because they might be more deforestation in their own country. I see this all the time. Vietnam has built dams on their own tributaries to the Mekong, and then they notice that their country shrinks because the Mekong Delta is affected by the dams they've built in their own country, and they're losing land. There's one policymaker that has agreed to the dam construction that traps all the sediments that now don't go into the delta in the own country, and then might lament the fact that, we are losing land area. So the complexity, I think, is a key challenge, and the fragmentation across all of these ministries and actors.
So, and to what extent, given what you've just said, and the extent of fragmentation, institutional fragmentation of this domain, then what does policy coherence mean in this context? Because we know that there are these silos, right? So how can they be addressed? What sort of policy coherence could we envisage that is able to address these silos, make the connections between the relevant governance institutions?
Well, I guess, the hope would be that different ministries and sectors would start talking more with each other. And this is a challenge across the board in development. It's not just for water. But it just for us, it was so incredible because it seemed so obvious that without water, you couldn't have food, but still they don't talk to each other. So we hope the book could be a start of this kind of conversation across the board, from local and even global processes, do not connect. And for that also we found extraordinary. And the fact that, now you do have this World Committee for Food Security that has commissioned different reports to look at linkages between food and water, I think is a very good or food and other aspects, and one of them was water. I think that was a good step, and that has pushed states and representatives to think about these interlinkages. In terms of the political issues, I mean, I think, let me just say that water is deeply political. Water is contested. But the lens that has been used to look at water traditionally was very engineering and economics dominated. And it's only maybe in the last 10 to 15 years that you have much more social science perspectives on water, looking at questions of rights, knowledge politics, power, etc. And I think that's really important. And the resistance also to looking at water as a human right also could be because, we're talking about the ones who lack water and food are very marginalized people who don't have a voice. And so their claims can easily be ignored too. And that's why, they're very invisible. But the water justice movement has focused on questions of privatization and large dams. It's been very, very vocal. But you don't have the equivalent of like a peasant movement, like you have the Viva Campesina movement with food. You just don't have that kind of global solidarity. It's small NGOs working together on some of these issues. And it would be great if, there could be more an international water justice movement around, the right to water or the right to water for livelihoods.
But are there country contexts where there's been more progress? In the book, you talk, for example, about Bolivia being quite progressive in recognizing the right to water and connecting it to the right to food, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there are several countries that have been progressive. So Bolivia, Ecuador, South Africa, several countries in Africa, so Zimbabwe, Kenya, they've made the linkages far more than other countries. And I think, in the global north, one can look to some of those countries to look at examples. But of course, just to have a constitutional right to water doesn't mean you're suddenly going to get water or you're going to get food. But at least you can, that means it's justiciable. You can go to court, you can make a claim. And several of these governments recognize these rights, but then violate them also. So you can have a mining company somewhere that will violate the right of indigenous people to their water, pollute the water resources. So you have all these contradictions taking place. But still, rights are only realized through struggle and mobilization, and having that constitutional right does make a huge difference.
And maybe also so in terms of, who has the recognition and trying to address this fragmentation of water. At the UN level, they have started UN Water a couple of years ago, where they're trying to have representatives of all the UN organizations that deal with water actually come together and develop a joint agenda. I think it has been very challenging, but they're at least trying, because you have WHO, you have UNICEF, you have UNESCO, so they're all linking in one way or another to water. And of course FAO, again, like the steward of for agriculture, where water is the largest user across all of the sectors. So they're trying to come together. It's just, I think, one indicator to show that there is a recognition that something has to be done. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we see globally.
But it's fair to say that UN Water is not as high profile as, let's say, the FAO or the World Committee for Food Security, because there you really have high profile UN agencies. And I guess because it's so fragmented and you have water addressed by UNICEF, WHO, the Joint Monitoring Program, everywhere, you don't have it all come together in that high-profile way.
So what's next for this research, and what's next for the sort of advocacy, the activism that underpins this book? Where do you see it going?
Well, we'd like some more dialogues, bringing together the different stakeholders, because, this is such a fragmented field. So really getting people to talk to each other about these linkages and connections would be great. We would also welcome the special rapporteurs on water, food, and water and sanitation, food and health to come together and explore the synergies more. The Human Rights Council, it would be great. We tried to do some of it earlier, but, it was a bit difficult. But maybe the time is more ripe to bring these people together and to really explore the synergies and linkages and also the violations and how one can address them.
Yeah, I think the book really pointed to a series of entry points, interventions to reduce inequity in access to water and food. And I think we hope, with this podcast, with other outreach activities, that we can get some of the players who can maybe help affect some of those entry points, such as the better realization of a right to water for food, recognition of traditional water rights for women and men, and understanding that there should be a more pro-poor and a more focus on marginalized areas and populations, and to maybe really show what the economic benefits, long-term sustainability benefits of such interventions are. I think there is still a lack of understanding, and there is still a complacency, thinking that business as usual will still kind of fly. I think going forward it will not fly, and we will see, as I said, if things fall apart, people will be on the move. They have always done that. That's what people do, and I think at the end of the day, this realization might only come when we see a lot more people on the move. But we hope that, as I said, the readers of the book and the other materials will take some actions before it comes to that.
I think it's also about holding powerful actors to account. So it's not just, I think what we found when doing the research for the book is we can't just focus on states, but there are very powerful actors, huge corporations, huge players that are now, they have a lot of convening power around decision making in water and food. And naming and shaming them, holding them to account is also an arena of activism. And it's really important. A lot of people are doing that already, but it needs to be, much more needs to be done in that regard.
Thank you very much. This was a very, very insightful conversation. And for me personally, I think this is a key resource for our teaching program on food and development at IDS, which I'm definitely going to add to my reading list. But I think there's also an important message of working across thematic areas, right, and speaking more to one another and learning from the field, seeing how in reality on the ground these things are connected. So we should be more modest and be learning more from the real life and make that reflect our ways of doing research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you have feedback and suggestions for upcoming episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at betweenthelines@ids.ac.uk.